Well, it's a blessing to see all of you today. So Roger's right. I do like to pray before I preach, and so if you'd indulge me, let's go to the Lord in prayer for a moment. So, our Heavenly Father, this is a blessing, and whenever we either I stand up to preach or we're sitting down and listening to your words spoken, we're reminded of how precious and important your word is, that it is your letter to us, and it is something that we can build our life on because it is true and it is reliable. And so thank you for the privilege of being able to come together and being able to read your word together and study it together. We would ask that you would work in our hearts, that we would all become more like Jesus because of you, and because of your goodness, and because of our time together. So thank you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So I'm going to break one of my rules. I normally don't include many scripture passages in the slides. You may have noticed that. That's intentional. And the goal is because when we're together and we are studying the Bible, I don't really want you looking at the slides mostly. I want you looking at your Bible in front of you. And so I normally don't put the scripture passages up there. But I had so many that I wanted to reference, we would be here until 6 o'clock at the very least if we were all looking up all the passages. So there's a bunch of them up here. Just do me a favor and make sure you look at your Bible as well. So that's more important. Let's go to the next slide here. This whole story reminded me of a scene from Lord of the Rings. If we had the lights a little dark, you'd probably see this is a sort of a tree-like looking something. His name is Treebeard, and he is a walking, talking tree. Now, if you're not a sort of a science fiction person, that seems a little weird, but for those of us that know and love Lord of the Rings, it gets exciting. This Merry and Pippin are hobbits, and they are captured by Treebeard, and they're somewhat understandably concerned about what this walking, talking tree is going to do to them. So they ask him an important question: whose side are you on? And Treebeard answers like this. He says, I am not altogether on anybody's side, because nobody is altogether on my side. Still, I take more kindly to elves than to others, and there are some things, of course, whose side I am not on. I am against them altogether. And so, in the Lord of the Rings, you don't mess with Ents, and in the book of Matthew, the Pharisees are learning you don't mess with Jesus. That the religious leaders are once again trying to trick Jesus and entangle him in his words and trying to make him choose a political side. They're going to say, are you on this side or are you on this side? And as we'll see in a minute, Jesus is going to turn the question back on them and ask if they are on his side, because his side's the only one that matters. So let's go to the next slide. Let's start by setting the scene. So Jesus is in the temple, and he arrived in the temple in Matthew 21, verse 23. He's going to be there for another chapter or two because he doesn't leave it until Matthew 24, verse 1. And so far, he has done 3 parables. He's done parable of the 2 sons, parable of the tenants, and parable of the wedding feasts. And in the parable of the 2 sons, he depicted the religious leaders as disobedient children. In the parable of the tenants, he depicted the religious leaders as robbers and murderers. And then in the parable of the wedding feast, he depicts the religious leaders as rebellious subjects that would rather just sort of hang out in their fields than do any sort of celebration with the king. The religious leaders now have gone through all sorts of stuff. They've listened to Jesus describe them in 3 different ways, none of which is particularly complimentary, and so you can understand they're not happy. In Mark, it says that they wanted to arrest Jesus on the spot, but they were afraid to do so because of all the other people that were there. And so, in good sort of tactical terms, they decided to withdraw, and they sort of collect themselves, and they come up with a new plan, which is the next phase in our sermon series. They're going to have 3 questions. They're going to have a question about taxes, they're going to have a question about the resurrection, and they're going to have a question about God's law. And these questions, even though when they sort of look at them on the surface, they seem like reasonable questions, and the answers are important. Their goal, though, is because they want the crowds to start hating Jesus as much as they do. Right? The reason they couldn't arrest Jesus? The crowds like Jesus too much. How do you fix the problem? ask Jesus a question so that he says something, and then the crowds won't like him anymore. That's the goal, all right? And then they're going to ultimately try and arrest him, and as we will see, they will execute him. We're going to focus on that first question today, the question of taxes. Let's go to the next slide here. Nothing brings people together like a common enemy. In this passage, we have the Pharisees and we have the Herodians. Now, the Pharisees were known for their religious and national fervor. The Herodians were known as for their commitment to King Herod. And King Herod was a puppet king that was put in place by the Roman Empire. So normally the Pharisees and the Herodians do not get along. They're on opposite ends of the religious and political spectrum. If you wanted to have a good argument, you would put a Pharisee and a Herodian together in the same room. Except neither one of them liked Jesus, which means they're natural allies. So the Pharisees and the Herodians get together, and they're going to try and trip up Jesus at the same time. And they come with a question. Now we're going to see, read that question in a moment. You can almost feel the insincerity dripping off of it through the pages, though. That they're going to say all these wonderful things about Jesus, and you know and I know they don't mean a word of it. All right, so Matthew 22:16. Teacher, we know you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and you do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances. See what I mean by that sort of, you almost feel greasy just reading it. It's awful. Tell us what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Now remember, they're in a public setting. It's not just them having a little private chat with Jesus. They are surrounded by hundreds of people. So you have the Pharisees and Herodians, opposite ends of the spectrum, and we just mentioned that, right? And they're surrounded by all these people. And this was a sharply divided topic in that day. Nobody likes paying taxes. These people really didn't like paying taxes because it reminded them that they were subject to Rome. And nobody liked being subject to Rome, so people are like, should we pay taxes or not? And some said yes, some said no. Now Jesus is being asked this question. And so there's this sharply divided opinion among the crowd, and there's even a sharply divided opinion among Jesus' disciples. Remember, Matthew was a former, what? Tax collector. So presumably, at least at one point in his life, he thought taxes were good. And then there was another disciple, Simon the Zealot. Does anybody remember what a zealot is? Other than he's zealous for something. So the zealots were anti-tax. The Romans instituted a tax in 6 AD, and the zealots rebelled. They started a war against the Roman Empire because they didn't want to pay taxes. And Simon is a former zealot. So even within Jesus' own 12 disciples, there's going to be some sharply divided opinions on this topic. And so the Pharisees and the Herodians have successfully painted Jesus in a corner. There's no easy, generally acceptable, make everybody happy kind of answer. If he says, yes, pay your taxes, he's going to upset the nationalists and the zealots. If he says, no, don't pay your taxes, he's going to get arrested by the Romans. Either way, the Pharisees and the Herodians are thinking, we win either way. This is a good question to ask. Why didn't we ask this one earlier, they would think? Now, Jesus, of course, knows exactly what he's doing, and he calls them on it in Matthew 22:18. It says, but Jesus, aware of their malice, said, why do you put me to the test, you hypocrites? This is why, in the picture, this guy is sweating, and he's looking like he's bracing for trouble. This is when, if you're the Pharisee or the Herodians, you'd be thinking, uh-oh, there's something bad is about to happen. We thought we had him, and we don't. What's going to happen next? And then Jesus lays it on him. He says in Matthew 20:19, show me the coin for the tax. And they brought him a denarius. Now let's go to the next slide here. Now this is not a denarius. This is a shekel, I believe, a silver shekel. It's called Tyrian currency. We talked about this last time I preached. Tyrian currency was the official currency in the temple. Again, it was made of silver. On the left side is a picture of a Greek god. And on the other side, there's an eagle. And this was what the official currency, if you wanted to pay your temple tax, you had to take your money and you had to exchange it for this shekel, and then you could pay the temple tax. And so it's what people have wondered. I did a lot of trying to understand why on earth would you have to have an official temple tax with a Greek god on it. That just seems weird. And it is weird, but it seems that this coin was famous for its consistent levels of silver purity and its consistent size. And so if you got a coin, you could be fairly certain you had X amount of silver in that coin. And so it's somewhere along the way someone decided, well, we'll just pretend there's not a Greek god on one side of the coin, and we'll make this our standard. All right, let's go to the next slide. There were no such excuses made for the Roman denarius. The Roman denarius was worth more. I don't know, maybe it's because it looks shinier in the picture, at the very least. It was certainly larger. On one side of the coin, you have Tiberius Caesar. Now, Caesar is not a name, it's a title, a little bit like king. So you have Tiberius on the left, and then you have this writing around the outside, and if any of you were good at Latin, you would be able to tell us that it says, Son of the Divine Augustus. All right? And then on the right, it's got this person, and they've got something in their hand, and they're sitting in a chair. And in that inscription around the outside, it says, the high priest. No such excuses. So they were willing to tolerate the Greek god on the Tiberian currency. This was offensive to the Jews. They didn't like this. Maybe it's because it came from Rome, but this was a big deal. And so much so the Romans knew it was offensive, they actually allowed the Jews to make their own copper coins that didn't have the head of Caesar on it. And what they found offensive was that they felt that it violated the first and second of the 10 Commandments. Remember those? You shall have no other gods before me, and you shall have no graven images. And so if you were a pious Jew, you would have looked at that and you said, I think that's wrong for me to own that. Now, we could go back and forth whether that's true, but that's the way they felt at the time. And so there's an irony. Jesus says, does anybody have a denarius? And the Pharisees kind of pat their pockets and they, I found one. Because these were the guys that were supposed to be the most pious of the group. Right? They boasted about their righteous superiority. Meanwhile, simultaneously, they're now trying to trap an innocent man, entangle him in his words, and by owning this, they would have, that their own admission, they would be violating the first and the second commandment. So you can sort of, just by asking for a denarius, Jesus is saying, you're not exactly as pure as you'd like us all to believe. All right, let's go to the next slide. Jesus then answers the question directly in Matthew 22, 20 to 21. Jesus said to them, whose likeness and inscription is this? Kids, who's that on the screen? That's little Caesar. Do you think that's real Caesar? Yeah. No. There is a little graphic, though. It says, render unto Caesar, and then it has this in the background. It's like, yes, you got to go eat more Little Caesar's pizza. That's not what it means, though. All right, so they said Caesar's, then he said to them, therefore render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God. And when they heard it, they marveled, and they left him, and they went away. We can break Jesus' answer into 3 parts. 2 parts are explicitly stated, 1 is implied. So, do we pay our taxes? Yes. All right. But don't give God's stuff to Caesar. That's the implied answer, right? Render to Caesar things that belong to him, to God that belong to God. Don't give God's stuff to Caesar. That's an implied answer. And then finally, give God everything. So let's go to the next slide. So first, let's pay your taxes. I liked this one over here, the thing on your side. The only certain in life is death, taxes, and Jesus. There you go. That's right. It got it right. There was one, though. It was a little comic. It had these 2 guys complaining about only death and taxes. And then someone comes up and yells, Jesus is alive. He said, well, maybe just taxes are the only thing you can rely on. Because apparently death couldn't hold Jesus. But death, taxes, and Jesus. what belongs to Caesar? So render to Caesar the things that are Caesar. He holds up a coin, Caesar's head on it. What belongs to Caesar? The coin Caesar authorized, right? So he's saying, Caesar says, give me your taxes in the form of the Roman denarius, which, oh, by the way, I made. Jesus is saying, give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. In a broader principle, though, it's not just a matter of paying taxes, and we'll expand this in a little bit, but the broader principle is that as Christians, we are commanded to be known for our civil obedience. Not civil disobedience, our civil obedience. And to sort of explain why, let's go to the next slide. We have here Romans 13, verses 1 and 2. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there's no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Next slide, please. All right, and then you have these other verses. So in 1 Timothy 2, 1 through 2, we're commanded to be praying for our leaders. In Titus 3, 1 and 2, we're told that we should be submitting to our leaders. And in 1 Peter 2:17, we're told that we should be honoring our leaders. The Roman government was not known for their righteousness. They were not a particularly pious group of people. They certainly were not more righteous than our current government. And yet we are commanded to submit and pray for and honor them. So we should be known for our civil obedience, which means we should be paying our taxes, we should be keeping our speed limits. If we violate the speed limit and we get busted, we should be gracious to the cops who pulled us over. We obey the town ordinances, we submit to state and federal laws, even the annoying ones. And we honor those in authority, even if they don't deserve it. There's no clause that says, honor the emperor if he's a nice dude. Right? Next slide. And we do that for at least 3 reasons. Number 1, Jesus says we should, which should be more than adequate. Okay, so Jesus says we should. We just read that. Number 2, Romans 13 says we should submit and honor to our leaders. And the reason it gives us is that submitting to our leaders is a way of submitting to God. So in some way, shape, or form, when we submit to our local government and we are civilly obedient to them, God says that's submitting to him too. And then thirdly, 1 Peter 2, 13 through 15 says that we do it for the Lord's sake. And that's an important phrase because that makes it a lot easier to submit to someone when they're really lousy. Right? We're not doing it for their sake. We are doing it for the Lord's sake. And let's go to the next slide and we'll have that verse up. It says, be subject for the Lord's sake, I highlighted it for you, to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. And here's the next line I wanted you to notice. For, remember, if you see the word for there, it's explaining a reason. So it gives a statement. This is why we're supposed to be subject. For this is the will of God. All right? That, there's another important word, it's explaining stuff again, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. You got that? You see the connection. It is hard to hate people when they behave well. It's even harder to hate the things they believe in when they behave well. And so when we are civilly obedient, it helps defend us from false accusations, it demonstrates God's kindness and grace, and it helps prevent putting up unnecessary barriers to the gospel. So that people can't just sort of blow us off, say, oh, those Christians, they never obey the speed limit, bunch of jerks, right? They say, wow, those Christians, they keep being nice, even when we try and do mean things to them. You see the difference? Don't just submit, though, because the authorities are worth submitting to. We submit because it pleases God. When we do so, we do it for the Lord's sake. All right, next slide. Second point, don't give God's stuff to Caesar. We're commanded to be civilly obedient, but our civil obedience has limits. You will have a hard time in the Bible finding a Bible verse that commands you to defend your personal rights. We like that here in America. You will have a hard, there might be one or two. It is hard to find them. You won't find them easily. It's a lot easier to find verses in the Bible that tell us to forego our personal rights in order to advance the gospel. The examples would be in Matthew 5, Romans 14, and 1 Corinthians 8. And you can find a lot of Bible verses in the Bible that tell us to do the right thing and to stand up for Christ regardless of the circumstances or the opposition. That makes sense? Next slide. So, what things do not belong to Caesar? Well, in this case, worship. Worship does not belong to Caesar. What did he have on his coin? He had a picture that said, Son of the Divine Augustus. Reading between the lines, apparently Caesar's, Tiberius Caesar in particular, thought he was God. Right? And then on the other side of the coin, what do you have? You have a picture of somebody sitting down. It's like the high priest. So he wanted to be God, and he wanted to be the ultimate worship leader. But we can't do that. We are worshiping government if we treasure it more than Jesus or if we fear it more than Jesus. So that's an important piece. That actually, by putting that part in, I took like 15 minutes out of my sermon. I had so much more I wanted to say on that. But it's important. If we are treasuring our government more than Jesus, then we are giving to Caesar what does not belong to Caesar. If we are fearing our government more than Jesus, then we are worshiping the government far more than we are worshiping God. Do you understand that? So we treasure and fear Jesus first and most and always. We do not treasure the government. We do not fear the government, and we most certainly do not worship the government. Now, the person back here, you can't really see him well. That is a marble statue of a Caesar called Nero. Nero was like one of the worst of the worst, okay? And so he became Caesar after Jesus was gone during the first sort of period of time when the early church existed. And he really, really, really wanted to be worshipped. And the Christians said, we can't worship you. And so he instituted this massive scheme of arresting Christians and then killing Christians, often in the arena. You remember the arena, the sort of big sporting events where everybody would sort of come together and they would watch people, often Christians, get killed, and that would be their sport. This is one of the guys that would do that. Nevertheless, the first century Christians refused to worship him, and they did what was right rather than what was easy. It would be nice if this was just a first century problem, but if you spend much time on CNN or Fox News, you will get the distinct impression that we have a lot of little Neros floating around. And they want to be first, and they want Jesus to be second. Let's go to the next slide. Which we cannot do. So our limit to our civil obedience is that Jesus is always first. Always. Always. Anything Jesus says is always first, regardless of what the authorities tell us, regardless of the amount of pressure they try to put on us. Jesus is always first, and you don't have to think very long to think of why, but here's 5 reasons. He's bigger. Jesus is bigger than Caesar. Jesus is better than Caesar. Jesus lasts longer than Caesar. There have been a lot of dead Caesars in history. Jesus is still alive. All right, Jesus is infinitely more precious, and he always wins in the end. Jesus is bigger. Jesus is better. He lasts for eternity. He's more precious, and he always wins. So ideally, our commitment to Christ can be expressed through our submission to the government, deference to others, graciousness and gentleness towards all. But if the authorities tell us to do something that is forbidden in Scripture, then we do not obey, we disobey, even if it costs us our job, our house, our freedom, our life, or anything else you could think of. Got that? We have limits, hard limits. We do not go past them. We need to be like the apostles in Acts 5. The authorities came to them and said, you need to stop telling people about Jesus. And they arrested them. And the apostles kept doing it anyway. In fact, as they had this sort of big confrontation, the authorities were like, you need to stop. And they said, no, we won't. And they get released. And they go out. And this is what the verse says. It says they were rejoiced that they were counted worthy to suffer dishonor for the name. And because they were willing to suffer instead of disobey Christ, the gospel continued to spread. God could have done it without, even if they had disobeyed. But you know what I mean. They obeyed, and the gospel continued to spread. Let's go to the next slide. Kids, this is why we had the story of the Daniel in the lion's den, right? This Daniel in the lion's den, the story was before Jesus. But the point stands, right? Kids, what did the religious leaders, these men, want Daniel to stop doing?
Praying.
They said stop praying. They wanted to stop praying because they wanted to be number one. And they thought they would try and trick the king into making sure these other scribes, they got to be number one. And then everybody else would be number two. So they said, let's make a rule. Let's make sure that he can't pray. And you know what the great thing is? They knew Daniel was going to keep praying because that was the whole point of the scheme, was that we know he's going to keep praying. Let's just make it illegal. And we know he'll do it anyway. Then we can punish him. They didn't care one bit about whether Daniel prayed. They wanted to get rid of him. Right, kids? And so Daniel, he kept praying. And in the book of Daniel, it says he kept praying in front of a window. I would have hid out in the closet or something wrong, I'm sure. But Daniel kept praying. They could see him praying, and because of that, Daniel got thrown into the lion's den. Daniel thought it was better to obey and to pray. That was not in my notes, but it did rhyme. It was better to obey and to pray than to keep living. He preferred to die. God in his kindness didn't let it happen. If you kids know the rest of the story, you know that the people who got in big trouble were those tricksters that tried to get Daniel in trouble. But that's for another day. So politics is not wrong. In fact, Romans 13, it can be very good. It's a good thing. It's a blessing. It's good for us to be involved. However, let's bring it back to our main point. Politics is always, always, always secondary to Christ. We obey when we can. We disobey stubbornly when any authority tries to become more important than Jesus. Got it? All right, let's go to the next slide. Give God everything. And I wish I could claim that one, but I couldn't. It says, give God what is right, not what is left. It's like, oh, that is a great sermon title. But it wasn't mine, it was somebody else's. But it's good nonetheless. Give God what is right, not what is left. I think this is the main point of Jesus' answer. And I think this is why the Pharisees marveled. They expected an answer about taxes. And for a very brief moment, I think they were pretty pleased with themselves because for once, Jesus gave them an answer. Remember the last time they tried to trick him? Jesus responded with a question. They didn't know. So Jesus said, I'm not going to answer your question. This time he does. And he says, pay your taxes. And they're like, yes, we got him. And then Jesus says, but. And that makes all the difference in the world. And he says, give to God the things that are God's. And so he turned the question back on the four Pharisees. Next slide. What belongs to God? Everything. More specifically, the Pharisees belong to God, you belong to God, and so do I. We belong to God because way back in Genesis, Genesis 1, the Bible says we were all made in the image of God. Right? So that when God looks at us, he says, my image is on you, you are mine. In the same way that Caesar could say, my image is on that coin belongs to me. See the connection there? So, you were made in the image of God. God owns you. You are his, which means he owns your stuff, and he owns your career. He owns mine too. He owns our finances and our affections, our relationships and our goals. He owns our retirement, and he owns our worship. Remember, we just talked about how we don't give our worship to anything else. God owns that. He dictates the number of hairs. We still have something. He dictates the amount of cartilage in your joints, right? For those of us that have arthritis. He dictates how the electricity flows through our hearts and whether we have any cancer cells in our body. There is nothing about us that God has not designed, anticipated, or planned for. We are his 100%. So we can very accurately say that God says we are his. You are mine. The question's not whether God owns us. He does. The question isn't even whether we will submit to his authority. I'll give you a spoiler alert. If you read the book of Revelation, you will discover that we will all submit one way or the other. The question isn't those things. The question is whether we do it willingly or we do it unwillingly. It's imperative that we give him what is right, not what's left over, not just the scraps that are left behind when we're done doing whatever we want, whenever we want, however we want. He gets the whole thing right up front. We give what is right, not what is left. Let's go to the next slide. So I want to be careful here, because if we just ended here, this sermon kind of becomes sort of a bludgeon. And sometimes bludgeons are helpful because if we have sin in our lives, we need to repent. And that was the tone that it was in the text. That the Pharisees needed to be rebuked. Jesus rebuked them. But if we just sort of end at this point and say, you belong to God, God says you are mine, then it's actually kind of bad news, because we spent our entire life rebelling against God. And we just read in 3 different parables what happens to people when they rebel against God. It's not good. We have the disobedient sons don't get into the kingdom of heaven. The faithless tenants are destroyed. The rebellious subjects are cast into the outer darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. And so just the statement where God says, you are mine, all by itself, that is not good news. Quite frankly, that's a little discouraging, kind of scary, bad news, except for the fact that we have Jesus and the gospel, which somehow transforms all of that into news that is remarkably wonderful. So that by God's grace, those things I just mentioned is not our fate, that we can be forgiven, we can be part of God's family, we can enter his presence and be 100% certain that we are acceptable, not because you are awesome or I am awesome, but because Jesus is awesome. We can serve him, and somehow we can know that he is always serving us and loving us more, far more than anything we ever do for him. And belonging to God becomes this marvelous, glorious blessing, where it's no longer just a commandment where we have to leave this sort of sermon. It's like, oh, I'm a terrible person, I need to shape up. It's true, we all do need to shape up, but that's not where we end it, because that's not where the gospel ends it. There is good news that this wonderful thing about us belonging to God is an immense, blood-bought, life-giving, don't waste your life type of blessing. You got all that? That Jesus paid the price, he died on the cross, so that the fact you belong to God is not bad news, it is good news. And if you are a Christian, you belong to God in the most glorious, wonderful way you can imagine. It is a blood-bought, life-giving, don't waste your life blessing. So giving God everything is not bad news. It's like, let's go to the next slide. It's like Matthew 6, verse 20 to 21. It's like laying up treasure in heaven. These are a picture of the crown jewels in London. We saw them on our trip. We were not allowed to take a picture of them, so that came from Google. So if you're with the British government, I didn't disobey. I submitted. Matthew 6, 20 to 21. Lay up treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys, destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. See the connection? God says, your life is mine. Jesus died for us, so that could be true for us too, that we could have treasures in heaven that are never destroyed or eaten up by moths or rust. Let's go to the next line. Giving God everything is suddenly like building our life on a solid rock. I am really glad I don't live or work in that lighthouse. That looks unpleasant. But Matthew 7:24-25, everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall because it had been founded on the rock. What happens if we try and hold on to our lives? Remember the rest of the story? It's like building it on sand. If that house was built on sand, that would be the last picture that was ever taken. Let's go to the next slide. Giving God everything is like it's being a seed planted in good soil. Matthew 13:23. As for what was sown in good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it. He indeed bears fruit and yields, in a case 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30. And then finally, this last slide, Matthew 13:44. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. I was excited about this picture because it's actually a treasure that was literally found in a field. Apparently out in California, this couple finds this tin can in the ground that's filled with gold uncirculated U.S. coins that was worth about $10 million. So as dirty and unappealing as the can is, I wish I had found that in my backyard, but I didn't. And I certainly would have bought that plot of land if I'd known it was on there. Look at all that. The kingdom of heaven, though, is like a treasure hidden in a field which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Giving God everything is a really good idea. You're not going to lose in the process. Let's go to the next slide. And so we have our summary. 3 thoughts I want you to remember. All right, so we pay our taxes, all right, and we submit to those in authority over us. We don't just do it because they deserve it. We do it for the Lord's sake. All right. Second thought, we don't give God's stuff to Caesar, namely our worship. We do not treasure the government more than Jesus, and we most certainly do not fear the government more than Jesus. Jesus always comes first, every time, 100%, no exceptions. Then finally, we give God everything. One last slide. I wanted to end on this verse because it kind of sums it all together. All right. Then Jesus told his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. So the Pharisees and the Herodians, they tried to defeat Jesus. And as a result, they ended up losing their souls and they went to hell. At least most of them did. I think 1 or 2 may have become saved, but we'll talk about that another time. Most of them did. And if we give our life to Jesus, and you give your life to Jesus, you will not lose, even if it ends up costing you your life, because you will be gaining Christ. And he's worth it. He's worth it like that. It's like that treasure in the ground would be worth whatever the cost of that land was. He's worth it. On that note, let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, and so thank you for turning news that would be really bad news. News that we belong to you and we are sinful. And that we deserve to be punished eternally. And that you make it into good news because now we can belong to you, and it's a marvelous thing because we are in your family and we've been made acceptable to you by Jesus. And you now delight in loving us and serving us, even as we are doing our best to love you and serve you. And so we would ask for your help if there are ways I'm sure there are in all of us. If there are ways in which we do not give you our entire life, help us to do so. Open our eyes, help us to see our sin, and then help us not to stay there, but we would turn our eyes to Jesus, and you would be our ultimate treasure and our ultimate hope. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.